We're going to learn Perek Aleph Halacha Gimel. The Rambam starts off in Elokim Mishum Le'yoreh V'Le'yomotza Lemkein Kona Chometz V'Pesach. We'll go down to the Pirush HaMeir, and here we have the concept that one does not receive Malchus. First of all, we'll cover the fact when you leave Chometz in Pesach, you don't get Malchus because it's a lav that has no action to it. In other words, you're not doing an active transgression, but rather a passive one. The chometz is there. When is it active and you get malchus? And also, what about chometz that's hidden and you can't see it? Is that considered part of the Isser of Le'Yeroya? And is Yeroya attached to Tashbisu, to the Asay, to the positive command of Tashbisu, just as Ve'eshiv Zagzela is attached to Zelo? Let us begin by reading Gimel. You do not get malchus for transgressing the Yerev Liyomotza. And Kain Kona Chometz Pesach, unless you did an active action of buying chometz on Pesach, or you took a dough and allowed it to become fermented chometz. That way he did an action. You get a malchus on an action. As the Maggid Mishnah explains, the cloud is found in Makis that you do not get malchus on a negative commandment that you do not do an active action. So Yosefta says that one who leaves chometz on Pesach and keeps klayim in his field doesn't get malchus because he's not doing an action, just like the Rambam here. Rabbeinu Menoach adds that Loshen Rambam oichi mutzoy, meaning does not mean that he left Seor in a dough and he actually actively worked with his hands. But even if he didn't actively do anything, he just left it there because automatically the fermentation process will take place, is considered an action. And so we find in Menachos that with regard to the nothing on the Mizbeach can be brought as chometz, and if somebody permits the korban mincha, the meal offering that he brings, to become chometz, he gets malchus, and there too it's talking that he just left it rise. The Re'im, on the question of whether you get one malchus for lo yirah and lo yimotza, or the Rambam just means to say one time you get malchus. The Rambam says you don't get malchus if you don't do an action. But if you did do an action, it would seem you get two malchus. One for lo yirah, it should not be seen, and one for lo yimotza. And he brings, actually, then Sefer HaMitzvahs, the Rambam counts these as two malchus. Therefore, you should get twice a punishment of malchus. But the rule is usually that when both are of the same source, same action, same accomplishment, even though they have different names, you don't get twice malchus. Just as we find by grapes and olives, it says loisa oilo, loisi foyer. And to gather pears, if one gathers that which drops down, he transgresses loisa oilo. And that which is left over from the olives, which drops down, is called loisa foyer. And if he did both at the same time, he doesn't get malchus twice, and therefore why should he get here twice malchus? So the Kesef Mishnah explains that we can explain that the Rambam doesn't mean that you get twice malchus, but he actually used, since he says at the beginning that you don't transgress bal yiroi bal yamotza, therefore he uses the plural language of lil kois, but he doesn't mean twice the malchus. Now, what is the rule with chometz that's hidden? Does he get malchus because of bal yiroi, or only bal yamotza? Bal yamotza means it should not be found in any case, whether you can see it or not. Bal yiroi would seemingly be only if you can see it. Now, the Kesef Mishnah explains that lo yiroi, you're over only on chometz which is visible to the eye. You go now to page 31, and the Pirush says that the Rabbi Rucham Perlo explained that the Rambam in Loisese 200, Sefer Mitzvah says we should not, we were admonished not to see chometz in all of our boundaries. And there's a second one, which is 201. We are not supposed to be find chometz in our possession, even if you don't see it. So, lo yirah is only when you see, and when it's not seen, you're over on Bal Yimotze. Now, the Rambam in Perek Dalad Aloha Beis says that you're over on Bal Yirah, Bal Yimotze. So it would seem on both, but it doesn't mean that you're always over on both of them. Just that it's possible to transgress both of them when the chometz is seen, but by chometz which is hidden, you can only be over on Bal Yimotze. And so too, we find in the Brisa, from where the Rambam learned his dinim, that that's the understanding. According to the Kesef Mishnah, the Rambam counted it as 2 laven, because chometz which is not seen, you cannot be over by Yirah. But the Re'im feels that even when it's not seen, you're over by Yirah, because not seeing means it should not be found. And so the Ran feels that way as well. And it says, when it says lo yimotze, that explains to us that lo yirah means it should not be found, rather than the physical aspect of seeing it. The Goin Mechel Zilber Shlita in the Sefer Lev Yam brings from Rashi, who says when feeding animals Erev Pesach, and you're afraid lest they leave something over, that the Mishnah has to mention Chayo and Behemo, because I would think that a Chayo you should give it to, because when it leaves over something, it hides it. And you will, Rashi uses a language like and then you won't see it. So it would seem Rashi does differentiate between seeing chometz and having it in your rishus. And the Girsa on the Gilyon of the Gemara does not have the text of Neheda Ova Bal Yimotze Bal Yirah Ova. He says that specifically that the text is that by a Chaya you're over only on Bal Yimotze, but not Bal Yirah. And Tosfos as well says Ve'ein Over Olam Mishum Bal Yatmin. The Bal Yatmin Avgalon and Bal Yimotze. You shouldn't hide chometz. We learn from the Isser of Yimotze. So we see that it's 2 separate understandings, Bal Yirah, Bal Yimotze, according to many Rishonim. However, the Rosh says, that which is hidden, you still a transgressor Bal Yirah. So this is a disagreement between the Rishonim and the Rambam. It's not sure what his position is. Now the Achronim ask a question: why should you get Malchus at all? The Tosfos in Sochim asks that Bal Yirah is attached to the Asay, the positive commandment of Tashbisu. As we said earlier, just like stealing is attached to the Asay of returning it, you don't get Malchus for it because you can return it. That is, therefore, as long as one hasn't burnt it, he has to burn it, but he doesn't get Malchus, because you don't get a Malchus on a lav which can be rectified by a positive commandment. And it would seem that's the Gemara in Psochim. And in the Mishnah Lamelech asks why the Rambam says that when he does an action, if he bought chometz or he permitted it to become dough to become fermented in chometz stick, it's considered he gets malchus. It should be considered attached to Eli and Asay. You shouldn't get malchus. And he explains that the Rambam would understand the Gemara Psochim Tzadikei is not according to Halacha. We don't say it's attached to the Asay. And there's a Tosefta that says Hamashayach chometz v'Pesach, Hamekayim Klayim Ein Aloike. And since the Tosefta says that, we turn the page to page 32. Thus we see Mashma Sherak Belav She'ein Boi Meiser. Only on a lav that doesn't have an action like Klayim, you don't get Malchus. But the inference is that if it does have an action, you do get a Malchus, just as Rashi says here. Now, the Magi and the Mishnah Lamelech brings down from Chuvas Harivosh, like the Rambam, that you would get Malchus. And the Maharsha proves from Tosfos and Rashi that they weren't Goyres, they did not have the text in the Gemara of the words that it is attached to an assay. And he brings in the Dvar Shmuel, who asks the same question. It's a lav anitek la'aseh, and he answers. The Dvar Shmuel wants to say that the only time you would get Malchus is when the 7th day of Pesach, which is the final day of Pesach, happened on Shabbos. So to rectify the lav, he would have to get rid of it. You can't burn it. On Shabbos you can't burn, and therefore you can't complete the rectification, and therefore he would get Malchus after Pesach before leaving Chometz ferment on Shabbos. The Chacham Tzvi asks a question from a Mishnah that only Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that you have to burn it. The Chacham say that it would suffice even if you make it into crumbs and throw it to the wind, or you throw it into the ocean, or you flush it down. And the Rambam paskins like the Chachomim. If that's the case, even if the 7th day of Pesach was on Shabbos, still he could have kept the commandment of getting rid of it by doing so. And therefore, we again have the opportunity to rectify. And whenever you can rectify, we do not say you get Malchus. So why does the Rambam state that if it's an active transgression of the Yirah, you get Malchus? The Magia. So the Mishnah Lamelech asks on the Chacham Tzvi that the Gemara, the Hamagid Mishnah writes, "Shamoitzi chometz b'Yom Tov." We know that on the first day of Yom Tov, if you have chometz, you're supposed to cover it, but you can't burn it. You can't get rid of it either by making it into crumbs and throwing it to the wind. And how could the Chacham Tzvi assume that on Yom Tov that happens on Shabbos, the last day of Pesach, it is Yom Tov, happens on Shabbos, and the Chacham Tzvi assumes you can throw it to the wind? And he wants to explain, therefore, that since you cannot throw it to the wind on Shabbos, and there's another Isser that you're not allowed to take something and cause it to become small particles, because that's like grinding. That's another reason why it shouldn't be permitted. And therefore, the Dvar Shmuel wants to explain that we're talking about on Shabbos, the 7th day, and there's no way to get rid of it, even according to the Chachomim. Chidushi Rabbeinu Chaim HaLevi on the Rambam has another explanation. That according to Rabbi Yehuda, that requires Sreifa, Ein Bir Chometz Elo Sreifa, he learns the Bir Chometz of Tashbisu is a mitzvah, obligation of burning chometz, that the chometz has to be burnt. It's associated with the chometz, and therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you can't have chometz and you have to burn chometz are associated with each other. So it's a lav hanitik la'aseh. The rectification is by burning that which you're not allowed to have of having the chometz. But according to the Chachomim, the tashbisu can be done in any fashion. That tells us that the lav is not associated with the item, the chometz, but rather that the owners cannot have chometz, and therefore he's mechadish that since the Rambam paskins like Chachomim that you can destroy it in any shape, fashion, or form, whether with fire or by making it into particles and throwing it to the wind or flushing it, but you would still get Malchus, because the lav is not associated with the assay of Tashbisu. You get Malchus on the lav, and the person is over on Tashbisu. It's not that the chometz has to be gotten rid of, but rather the person shouldn't have chometz. And therefore, you can have many things. Yom Tov, you're over on positive commandments and negative commandments, and they're not necessarily rectification of one to the other. And therefore, even if somebody rectifies, even if somebody accomplishes the positive commandment of getting rid of chometz with sreifa, that is just like getting rid of noiser, and has nothing to do with the lav that he transgressed, and for the lav, therefore, he would get Malchus. We will continue Mitzvah on 32 on the next halacha on page 33 in the next year.